Before the world gave him a name to measure himself against, there was the mirror. It was a tall, severe thing, framed in black and silver, its surface imbued with a faint, discerning magic. It did not show you what you most desired, nor did it merely reflect what stood before it. This mirror, a Malfoy heirloom, showed you what you were expected to be. It sharpened the line of a jaw, straightened the fold of a collar, and erased any hint of uncertainty from the eyes. For a boy of 10, it was a tutor more constant than any governess. Draco Lucius Malfoy stood before it daily. He was a pale child, with hair so light it was almost white, and a pointed chin that was a perfect echo of his father's. He would practice the expressions he saw on the adults who moved through the halls of Malfoy Manor. The slight, knowing tilt of the head, the slow blink of dismissal, the thin, bloodless smile that was not a smile at all, but a baring of teeth, a warning. The mirror would approve, subtly altering the light to make him look taller, colder, more formidable. It showed him the man he was supposed to become, and the boy, eager for approval, learned his lines. His world was one of immense privilege, a tapestry woven from gold galleons, ancient bloodlines, and the quiet, unshakable belief in his own superiority. Malfoy Manor was not a home so much as a monument to that belief. Its rooms were vast and cold, filled with the stern faces of ancestors in portraits whose eyes followed you with silent judgment. Peacocks roamed the grounds, their preening beauty a perfect metaphor for the family they served, magnificent, arrogant, and utterly useless in a fight. From his father, Lucius, he learned about power. Power was a tool, a lever, to move the world. It was held in the ministry, in the weight of a name, in the strategic whisper in the right ear. Lucius moved through life with a languid grace that belied the coiled tension beneath. He taught Draco that their family name was a key that opened any door and a shield that deflected any blame. Weakness, he would say, his voice a silken threat, was the only unforgivable sin. Emotion was a form of weakness, pity, another. From his mother, Narcissa, he learned about love, though it was a love as carefully contained as a rare potion. Her affection was a soft hand on his hair, a quiet word of praise when he mastered a new piece on the harpsichord, a fierce, protective glint in her eyes when anyone dared to slight him. It was Narcissa who told him the stories of the noble and most ancient House of Black, her lineage, a dark and glittering inheritance of its own. She taught him pride not as a tool, but as a birthright. Her love was the one truly warm place in the cold manor, but it was a warmth that came with its own set of expectations. He was her perfect, precious son. He must never, ever disappoint her. And so the boy in the mirror rehearsed. He learned the vocabulary of prejudice before he understood the words. Mudbloods, blood traitors. Words dropped into conversation at dinner parties, like cubes of sugar, sweetening the bitter brew of ideology. He learned that the world was divided into those who mattered and those who did not, and that he, by the sheer, glorious accident of his birth, was one of the few who mattered. The mirror showed him a king in waiting, and he believed it. He had no reason not to. The grounds of the manor were his kingdom, the house elves his subjects. He had never known hunger, or fear, or the simple, humbling experience of being told no. But even then, in the quiet moments after the performance was done, a different boy sometimes flickered in the glass. A boy with a flicker of uncertainty in his gray eyes. A boy who wondered if the weight of the name he was so proud to carry was not a crown, but a cage. The mirror would quickly correct the image, smoothing away the doubt, sharpening the sneer. The reflection was the promise. The reflection was the path. Draco Malfoy, aged 10, knew his destiny was to be great, to be powerful, to be feared. He had seen it every day of his life. He simply had not yet understood the cost of that reflection, or the long, painful journey it would one day take to finally let it shatter. The weight of a name. The name Malfoy was a physical presence in every room of the manor. It was carved into the stone above the grand fireplace, woven into the tapestries that depicted grim-faced ancestors vanquishing their foes, and spoken in hushed, reverent tones by the house elves who served the family. For Draco, the name was his first and most important possession. It was armor. It was a weapon. It defined him before he had a chance to define himself. Lucius Malfoy impressed upon his son the gravity of their heritage from the moment Draco could understand words. Lessons were not about history, but about their history. The Malfoys, Lucius explained, had always navigated the currents of power with cunning and foresight. They had counseled kings and ministers, acquiring land and influence by knowing which way the political winds were blowing. They were survivors, Lucius would say, his hand resting on the head of his snake-handled cane. But more than that, they were masters of the game. Draco absorbed these lessons as a plant absorbs sunlight. He learned that their immense wealth was not just for comfort. It was a measure of their worth. Every expensive toy, every perfectly tailored robe, every rare magical artifact in his father's collection was a testament to the Malfoy superiority. He was taught to see the world through a lens of purity and status. The Weasleys, with their red hair and their hand-me-down clothes, were an object of particular scorn. They were purebloods, yes, but they were blood traitors, squandering their magic by associating with Muggles and sympathizing with Muggle-borns. They were an embarrassment to the wizarding world, a cautionary tale of what happened when one forgot the importance of ambition and pride. Narcissa's lessons were subtler, but no less potent. She taught him the intricate dance of pure blood society. He learned which families to flatter, which to disdain, and how to deliver an insult wrapped in the silk of a compliment. She would host teas in the conservatory, the air thick with the scent of lilies and the venom of polite gossip. Draco would sit quietly, listening, observing the delicate power plays, the veiled threats, the alliances forged and broken over a cup of Earl Grey. He learned that a reputation was a fragile, precious thing, and that the Malfoy name must always be associated with elegance, influence, and impeccable breeding. His childhood was a strangely isolated one. He had no friends his own age, save for the children of his father's associates. Vincent Crabbe and Gregory Goyle were the sons of Death Eaters, lumpen boys who orbited Draco with a dull, unquestioning loyalty. They were not friends so much as followers, his first sycophants. Their admiration was another mirror in which he could see his own importance reflected. He led them in minor acts of cruelty, tormenting the garden gnomes or using his first clumsy attempts at magic on the peacocks. Crabbe and Goyle would laugh, their vacant expressions filled with awe. Draco learned early that power was easily won over the weak-willed. It felt good. It felt right. But the name was a burden too. It carried the weight of expectation. At any sign of weakness or sentimentality, Lucius's gaze would turn cold. When Draco fell from his first broomstick and cried, his father had not comforted him, but had chided him for his lack of control. Malfoys did not cry. Malfoys did not fail. The pressure was immense, a constant, low-level hum beneath the surface of his privileged life. He had to be the best, the smartest, the most powerful. Anything less was a stain on the family name. This pressure bred a deep-seated insecurity, a gnawing fear of failure that he masked with arrogance. His sneer was a shield. His taunts were a preemptive strike against anyone who might see the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. He needed to believe in his own superiority because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. If he was not special, if he was not better than everyone else, then he was nothing. He was just a boy, small and scared, lost in a vast, cold house. The impending arrival of his Hogwarts letter was a source of both excitement and anxiety. It was his chance to step onto a larger stage, to prove to his father and to the world that he was a worthy heir. There was no question which house he would be in. Slytherin was his birthright, the house of ambition, of cunning, of pure bloods. It was the house of his parents, his grandparents, and generations of Malfoys before them. He imagined himself in the dungeons, wearing the green and silver, the undisputed Prince of Slytherin. It was the next chapter in the story that had already been written for him, the story of the great and powerful Draco Malfoy. He could not wait for it to begin. He did not know that the name he carried, the name he thought was a fortress, would one day become his prison. The first train, and the first enemy. The journey to King's Cross Station was a grand affair. The Malfoys did not deign to use the Muggle entrance. Lucius arranged for a private flue connection, directly to a discreet antechamber near platform 9 3/4. Draco stepped out of the green flames into a world buzzing with an energy he had never experienced before. The air was thick with steam and the excited chatter of hundreds of families. Owls hooted, cats meowed, and a fat toad let out a mournful croak. For a moment, Draco was just a boy, wide-eyed and overwhelmed. He saw children hugging their parents, their faces a mixture of tears and thrilled anticipation. He felt a pang of something unfamiliar, a desire for that kind of uncomplicated warmth. He glanced at his own parents. Lucius stood tall and aloof, his gaze sweeping over the crowd with disdain. Narcissa gave his shoulder a quick, tense squeeze, her public displays of affection always brief and restrained. "Make us proud, Draco," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. The moment of vulnerability passed, replaced by the familiar weight of expectation. He swaggered onto the train, Crabbe and Goyle trailing in his wake like two lumbering bodyguards. He found an empty compartment and immediately set about holding court, boasting about the new broomstick his father had promised to buy him, and speculating loudly about the famous Harry Potter, the boy who had somehow defeated the Dark Lord. Draco spoke of Voldemort with a kind of second-hand reverence, echoing the hushed, respectful tones he had heard his father use. He presented the story not as a victory for the light, but as a mystery, a temporary setback for a great and powerful wizard. It was then that the door to his compartment slid open. A boy with untidy black hair and startlingly green eyes stood there, accompanied by a tall, gangly redhead with a smudge of dirt on his nose. Draco recognized the poverty in the redhead's worn robes instantly. A Weasley. And the other boy, with the lightning bolt scar just visible beneath his fringe, it could only be Harry Potter. Here was his moment. This was the encounter he had been rehearsing in his mind for weeks. Harry Potter was a celebrity, a symbol. To befriend him would be a coup, a clear statement of Draco's own importance. He saw it all laid out before him. The two of them, the most famous boys at Hogwarts, striding through the halls together, a new wizarding aristocracy. He stood up, extending a pale, slender hand. He introduced himself, his voice smooth and practiced. He offered Potter his guidance, his expertise. He explained, with a pointed sneer at Ron Weasley, that there were some wizarding families that were better than others. He could help Potter avoid making friends with the wrong sort. It was a perfectly executed opening gambit, straight from his father's playbook of power and influence. And Harry Potter turned him down. He did not just refuse, he did it with a quiet, firm dignity that was more insulting than any shout. He said he could tell the wrong sort for himself. The words hung in the air, a stunning rejection. Draco's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. He was not used to being refused anything. He was a Malfoy. People sought his favor. They did not reject it. The humiliation was a hot, bitter flush that crept up his neck. His hand, still extended, felt heavy and foolish. He dropped it to his side. The sneer that had been a confident accessory now became a desperate defense. He lashed out, mocking Ron's family, his poverty, anything to regain the upper hand, to wound as he had been wounded. The confrontation ended with a clumsy scuffle, Crabbe and Goyle's pet rat, Scabbers biting Goyle's finger, and the two newcomers leaving the compartment, leaving Draco seething in their wake. The rest of the train ride was sour. The sweets from the trolley tasted like ash. His boasts to Crabbe and Goyle rang hollow. He had met his great rival, the boy who was supposed to be his peer, and he had been found wanting. Potter had chosen a Weasley over a Malfoy. It was an incomprehensible insult, a fundamental misreading of how the world was supposed to work. That day, on the Hogwarts Express, Draco Malfoy made his first true enemy. It was not a calculated rivalry based on ambition or house loyalty. It was a raw, personal animosity, born of a single, stinging moment of rejection. Harry Potter had looked at the world Draco offered him, a world of status, purity, and power, and had decided he wanted no part of it. In doing so, he had not just insulted Draco, he had invalidated his entire existence. From that moment on, Draco's mission was clear. He would make Harry Potter pay. He would prove to him, and to everyone at Hogwarts, that he had made a terrible mistake. He would be better, stronger, and more powerful. He had to be. His pride, his name, his very sense of self depended on it. Quidditch weather. The sky over the Hogwarts grounds had a particular quality on Quidditch days. It was a vast, dramatic canvas, sometimes a brilliant, cloudless blue, other times a moody swirl of gray and silver. For Draco, this was the weather of possibility, the air he was meant to breathe. Flying was the one place where the complexities of his life seemed to fall away, leaving only the rush of the wind, the thrum of the broomstick beneath him, and the singular, obsessive focus of the hunt. He had not made the Slytherin team in his first year, a bitter disappointment. He had watched from the stands as Harry Potter, a first year, had been made seeker for Gryffindor, another galling injustice. But Lucius Malfoy did not accept disappointment. In Draco's second year, his father made a generous donation to the Slytherin team. 7 brand-new Nimbus 2001 broomsticks, the fastest and most advanced racing brooms in the world. They were sleek, black, and beautiful, and they bought Draco his place on the team as seeker. He knew what the other houses whispered. He heard the taunts from the Gryffindors that he had bought his way onto the team. He retorted with the easy cruelty that was his hallmark, calling Hermione Granger a filthy little mudblood, a slur so potent it stopped even his own teammates in their tracks. The words felt powerful on his tongue, a spell to inflict pain, a way to assert his dominance when he felt his legitimacy was being questioned. But the accusation stung because it was true. He had not earned his place on merit alone. The shadow of his father's influence loomed even here, hundreds of feet above the ground. Still, when he was in the air, none of that seemed to matter. The roar of the crowd, the flash of house colors, the blur of the bludgers, it was a glorious, chaotic symphony, and he was at its heart. As seeker, his role was one of elegance and obsession. While the chasers fought for the quaffle and the beaters defended their teammates, he floated above the fray, his eyes scanning, searching for the tiny, elusive flicker of gold. The golden snitch was more than just a ball. It was victory incarnate. It was worth 150 points, and its capture almost always ended the game. For Draco, catching the snitch was the ultimate validation. It was a purely individual triumph, a moment of singular glory that could not be shared or diminished. It was proof of his superior reflexes, his sharper eyes, his better broom. His rivalry with Potter found its purest expression in the skies above the Quidditch pitch. Chasing the snitch became a microcosm of their entire relationship. It was a frantic, desperate pursuit, with both boys pushing their bodies and their brooms to the absolute limit. They would dive, swerve, and climb, their robes whipping in the wind, the world reduced to the two of them, and the tiny winged ball that darted just out of reach. In these moments, there was a strange kind of intimacy. In the air, stripped of their friends and their house loyalties, they were just two boys who were exceptionally good at the same thing. Draco could almost respect Potter's skill as a flyer, his reckless courage, his uncanny instinct for the game. But that respect was always curdled by the bitter sauce of his jealousy. Potter flew with a natural, joyful abandon, as if he had been born in the air. Draco flew with a tense, desperate precision, driven by the burning need to prove himself. He rarely won. More often than not, it was Potter's hand that closed around the snitch, his arm that was raised in victory, his team that was engulfed by a wave of cheering scarlet and gold. Each loss was a fresh wound to Draco's pride. He would land heavily, his face pale with fury, ignoring his teammates' commiserations. He would have to face his father after the match, have to endure the cool, disappointed look in his eyes. Lucius did not tolerate failure, especially not at the hands of Harry Potter. The Quidditch pitch was Draco's sanctuary and his torment. It was the one place he felt truly alive, and the one place where his failures were most public. The clean, cold air was a relief from the stifling politics of the Slytherin common room, but it was also the arena of his greatest humiliations. He loved the game with a fierce, possessive passion, but he hated what it represented. Another contest he could not seem to win, another way in which Harry Potter effortlessly overshadowed him. He would keep trying, keep pushing, keep buying better brooms. He had to. To give up would be to admit defeat, not just in a game, but in the larger war for status and recognition that defined his young life. A lesson with consequences. The study of magical creatures was, in Draco's opinion, a thoroughly ridiculous subject. It involved dirt, mud, and a variety of smelly, uncivilized beasts. He much preferred the precise, intellectual rigor of potions, or the dark elegance of the defense against the dark arts. But in his third year, care of magical creatures became unavoidable, taught by the oafish groundskeeper Hagrid. It was an insult to his dignity. The appointment of Hagrid as a professor was, to Draco, a perfect example of Dumbledore's absurd and dangerous sentimentality. The man was a half-giant, a bumbling fool, with a fondness for monstrous things. Draco saw it as his duty to mock the proceedings, to undermine Hagrid's authority at every turn, and to remind everyone of the man's incompetence. It was a performance for his fellow Slytherins, a way of reinforcing the natural order of things, where people like Hagrid served people like him. The first lesson was a disaster waiting to happen. Hagrid, with his typical lack of judgment, introduced the third-year students to a flock of hippogriffs. They were magnificent creatures, half horse, half eagle, with proud, sharp eyes and dangerously sharp talons. They were also intensely proud and easily offended. The key, Hagrid explained, was to show them respect, to bow, and to wait for them to bow back before approaching. Harry Potter, of course, managed it perfectly. He approached the lead hippogriff, a handsome gray beast named Buckbeak, with a calm confidence that infuriated Draco. He bowed, was accepted, and was soon soaring over the grounds on the creature's back, a picture of heroic grace. The other students watched in awe. Draco watched with a familiar, sour twist of jealousy in his gut. When Potter landed, flushed with success, Draco could not stand it. The attention, the admiration, the effortless way Potter seemed to command respect from both humans and beasts, it was all too much. He had to puncture the moment, to bring Potter back down to earth, to remind everyone that he was not untouchable. He swaggered forward, dismissing Hagrid's warnings with a contemptuous wave of his hand. He sneered at Buckbeak, calling him a great ugly brute. He was not just insulting the creature, he was insulting Potter by extension, mocking the thing that had just given him his moment of glory. He was showing off for Crabbe and Goyle, performing the role of the arrogant pureblood who was above the rules. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Buckbeak, deeply insulted, reared up and slashed with its front talons. Pain, sharp and shocking, exploded in Draco's arm. He fell to the ground, his robes stained with blood, the world dissolving into a haze of shock and agony. He had never experienced pain like it. His privileged life had insulated him from all but the most minor of scrapes. This was a violation, a profound and terrifying intrusion into his sense of invincibility. He milked the injury for all it was worth. He lay on the ground, groaning that he was dying. He allowed himself to be carried to the hospital wing, like a fallen prince. He reveled in the attention, the sympathy, the drama. His arm was bandaged and put in a sling, a badge of his victimhood that he wore for weeks, long after the injury had healed. He made Crabbe and Goyle carry his books, write his notes, even cut up his food. He used the incident to excuse himself from any work he found tedious. But this was more than just an act of malingering. It was an opportunity. His father was furious. Lucius Malfoy saw the injury not as the result of his son's foolish arrogance, but as a grave injustice perpetrated by an incompetent teacher and a dangerous beast. He saw a chance to exert his influence, to have Hagrid sacked, and perhaps even to have the Hippogriff destroyed. Draco became the centerpiece of his father's campaign. He gave dramatic, exaggerated testimony to the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures. He described the attack in lurid detail, painting himself as an innocent victim and Buckbeak as a bloodthirsty monster. He enjoyed the power it gave him, the ability to ruin a man's career and end a creature's life with a few well-chosen words. It was the kind of power his father wielded every day, and it felt intoxicating. Buckbeak was sentenced to death. For a time, Draco felt a grim sense of satisfaction. He had won. He had turned a moment of humiliation into a victory. He had used the system, just as his father had taught him, to get what he wanted. He taunted Potter and his friends, gloating about the impending execution. But as the day approached, a small, unwelcome sliver of discomfort lodged itself in his mind. He had not wanted the creature to be killed. Not really. He had wanted to win, to assert his dominance, to see Potter and his friends unhappy. The reality of the execution, the cold, final fact of it, was more than he had bargained for. It was a consequence that felt disproportionate and ugly. He pushed the feeling down, burying it under another layer of arrogance. But it was there, a faint, discordant note in the symphony of his triumph. He was learning a valuable lesson, one that his father had tried to teach him for years, that actions have consequences. He just had not yet learned to distinguish between the consequences he desired and the ones that would eventually come to haunt him. The taste of authority. Draco's 5th year at Hogwarts was a time of profound change. The return of Lord Voldemort had been officially denied by the Ministry of Magic, but the air was thick with rumor and fear. The Ministry, in its desperate attempt to control the narrative, installed Dolores Umbridge as the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, and later as the Hogwarts High Inquisitor. Umbridge was a woman cut from a cloth Draco understood well. She was clad in pink, but her soul was pure Ministry-approved steel. She believed in order, in purity, in the suppression of dissent, and in the absolute authority of the powerful. She represented everything the Malfoys respected. Her arrival was, for Draco, a welcome shift in the school's power dynamics. Dumbledore's sentimental, muggle-loving reign was finally being challenged by a woman who understood the importance of discipline and control. He thrived under her regime, while other students chafed under her restrictive educational decrees and her saccharine, condescending tone. Draco saw an opportunity. He became one of her favorites, a model student who eagerly absorbed her Ministry-approved, theory-only curriculum. He understood that ingratiating himself with Umbridge was a direct path to power within the school. The formation of the Inquisitorial Squad was the culmination of his efforts. Umbridge created the squad as a group of student enforcers, a private police force loyal only to her. They were given powers that no student had ever held before: the authority to dock points from other houses, to patrol the corridors, and to punish their peers. Membership was by invitation only, extended to students Umbridge deemed trustworthy, which in practice meant the children of influential Ministry officials and those who shared her prejudiced worldview. It was, almost exclusively, a Slytherin institution. Draco was not just a member, he was a leader. He wore the small silver eye on his robes like a medal of honor. For the first time, he had real, officially sanctioned authority. It was more intoxicating than any potion. He patrolled the hallways with Crabbe and Goyle, his posture straighter, his sneer more pronounced. He finally had the power to punish Harry Potter and his friends legally. He abused this power with relish. He delighted in catching students out of bounds, in docking points from Gryffindor for the most trivial of infractions. He cornered first years and terrorized them, enjoying the fear in their eyes. This was not the petty bullying of his earlier years. This was something more. This was the exercise of institutional power. He was an agent of the ministry, a defender of the new order. He felt important. He felt untouchable. His finest moment came when he and the other members of the Inquisitorial Squad managed to capture Harry Potter and the members of Dumbledore's army in the Room of Requirement. He personally dragged Potter to Umbridge's office, his hand tight on the back of his rival's robes, a surge of triumph coursing through him. He had done it. He had caught the great Harry Potter breaking the rules, had exposed his secret rebellion. He watched with grim satisfaction as Umbridge prepared to use the Cruciatus curse on Potter, a thrill of dark anticipation running down his spine. This was what true power looked like. It was not about winning a Quidditch match or being clever in class. It was about the ability to control others, to inflict your will upon them, to break their spirit. He was learning the lessons his father had tried to teach him, not just in theory, but in practice. He was becoming the man he was always meant to be. But there was a hollowness to it as well. The power he wielded was not his own. It was borrowed from Umbridge, who in turn borrowed it from the Minister for Magic, Cornelius Fudge. He was a proxy, a pawn in a much larger game. His authority was conditional, dependent on the favor of his superiors. And there were moments, in the dead of night, when he lay in his four-poster bed in the Slytherin dungeons, that he felt a flicker of doubt. The fear on the faces of the students he punished sometimes looked a little too real. The cruelty he saw in Umbridge's eyes was a little too cold. He was on the winning side, he told himself. His father was an important man, close to the minister. The Malfoys always backed the right horse. This was how the world worked. And yet, he could not shake the feeling that the ground beneath his feet was shifting. The Inquisitorial Squad was a taste of authority, a heady and addictive draft. But it was also his first real lesson in the nature of complicity. He was tying his fate to that of Umbridge and the ministry, believing it to be the path to glory. He did not yet realize that he was walking into a trap of his own making, a trap from which there would be no easy escape, a door that will not open. The summer before his 6th year was the summer the world turned dark. Lord Voldemort had returned, openly and undeniably. The battle at the Ministry of Magic had been a disaster for Lucius Malfoy. He had failed in his mission to retrieve the prophecy and had been arrested, humiliated, and sent to Azkaban. The Malfoy name, once a shield of burnished gold, was now tarnished, a mark of failure in the eyes of the Dark Lord. Draco returned to Malfoy Manor to find it a changed place. The peacocks were still on the lawn, but their cries sounded like warnings. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. His mother, Narcissa, was a ghost of herself, her elegant composure shattered by a brittle, desperate fear. The Dark Lord and his followers now used the manor as a headquarters. The drawing room, where Narcissa had hosted her polite teas, was now the scene of terrifying meetings, the air thick with dark magic and the scent of fear. Voldemort was not a distant, legendary figure anymore. He was a physical presence in Draco's home, a serpent-faced monster whose red eyes seemed to see straight through him, peeling away the layers of arrogance to reveal the terrified boy beneath. Draco had been raised to revere this man, to see him as the savior of the pure-blood cause. But up close, there was no ideology, no noble cause. There was only a terrifying, capricious power that fed on pain and fear. It was in this atmosphere of dread that Voldemort gave Draco his assignment. It was presented as an honor, a chance for the Malfoy family to redeem itself. He was to succeed where his father had failed. He was to find a way to bring the Death Eaters into Hogwarts, right under the nose of Albus Dumbledore. And he was to perform one other task, a task so monstrous that Voldemort hissed it in a whisper, as if the words themselves were poison. He was to kill Albus Dumbledore. Draco was 16 years old. The task was a death sentence. He knew it. His mother knew it. And he was sure Voldemort knew it too. It was not an honor. It was a punishment for his father's failure. He was being set up to fail, and his death would be the final ignominious chapter in the fall of the House of Malfoy. But to refuse was to invite immediate death for himself and his mother. He had no choice. He accepted the mark, the skull and serpent now burned into his left forearm, a permanent brand of his servitude. He returned to Hogwarts a different person. The swagger was gone, replaced by a gaunt, hunted look. He abandoned his friends, his Quidditch, his role as the Prince of Slytherin. He had only one purpose now: survival. He spent his days and nights in the Room of Requirement, the place he had once breached as a proud member of the Inquisitorial Squad. Now, it was his workshop, his prison, his only hope. His plan centered on a pair of vanishing cabinets. One was at Hogwarts, in the Room of Requirement. Its twin was miles away, in Borgin and Burke's, the dark art shop in Nocturne Alley. If he could repair the broken cabinet at Hogwarts, he could create a secret passage, a magical corridor that would bypass all of the school's formidable defenses. The work was grueling and complex. He was not a natural at this kind of intricate, subtle magic. He pored over arcane texts, his hands stained with potion ingredients, his mind swimming with complex incantations. He was utterly alone. He could not trust anyone. His fellow Slytherins saw his obsession and his secrecy as a sign of weakness. Even Snape, his head of house and a man he had always respected, seemed to be watching him with a mixture of pity and contempt. Snape offered to help, but Draco, terrified and proud, refused. This was his task, his burden. To accept help would be to admit failure before he had even begun. He became a ghost in the castle, his skin pale, dark circles under his eyes. He was plagued by nightmares, by the constant gnawing fear of failure. Every day that passed was another day closer to the moment when Voldemort would demand a reckoning. The pressure was unimaginable. It began to crack him open, stripping away the layers of privilege and arrogance to reveal the terrified child at the core. His attempts to assassinate Dumbledore were clumsy and desperate, born of panic. He sent a cursed necklace, which ended up nearly killing Katie Bell. He poisoned a bottle of mead, which Ron Weasley drank by mistake. He was failing. Every mistake, every near miss, tightened the knot of fear in his stomach. He was not a killer. He did not have the stomach for it. The cold, detached cruelty that his father and the other Death Eaters seemed to possess. He was just a boy, playing a man's game, and the stakes were his life and his mother's. The vanishing cabinet became his sole obsession. It was a door that would not open, a puzzle he could not solve. And on the other side of that door, an army of murderers was waiting. Bleeding in the bathroom, the pressure was becoming unbearable. Draco felt as though he were being hollowed out from the inside, his organs replaced with a frantic, buzzing panic. He barely slept. When he did, his dreams were filled with the image of Voldemort's snake-like face, his red eyes glowing with cold fury. He saw his mother, her face pale with terror. He saw Dumbledore, his expression not of anger, but of a deep, profound disappointment that was somehow worse. He avoided everyone. His old routines, his old pleasures, were meaningless. He no longer cared about Quidditch scores or house points. The petty rivalries that had once consumed him now seemed like games for children. He was living in a different world, a world of life and death stakes, and no one else seemed to see it. They saw a moody, secretive teenager. They did not see a boy who was being slowly crushed to death by the weight of an impossible task. He caught his reflection in a window one afternoon and barely recognized himself. He was gaunt, his skin had a grayish, unhealthy pallor, and his eyes were wild with a sleepless, hunted fear. The handsome, arrogant boy who had left for the summer was gone. In his place was this haunted stranger. The sight filled him with a fresh wave of self-loathing. He was weak, he was failing. His father would be ashamed of him. He sought refuge in the sixth-floor boys' bathroom, a place few students used because of the incessant wailing of moaning Myrtle. He wanted to be alone, to let the carefully constructed mask of composure fall away. He leaned over a sink, his hands gripping the cold porcelain, and stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror. The face that stared back was a ruin. Tears, hot and shameful, began to fall. He had not cried since he was a small child. Crying was a weakness, a luxury he could not afford. But the sobs came anyway, ragged and uncontrollable, torn from a place of absolute despair. He was trapped. There was no way out. If he succeeded in his mission, he would be a murderer, his soul forever stained. If he failed, he and his mother would be killed in the most painful way imaginable. He was 16 years old, and his life was over. It was in this moment of complete vulnerability that Harry Potter found him. Draco sensed him before he saw him, a presence in the doorway. He spun around, his wand instantly in his hand, his grief transmuting into a white-hot rage. He saw Potter's face, the familiar mix of suspicion and animosity, and something inside him snapped. He blamed Potter for everything. If it were not for Potter, the Dark Lord would have won years ago. His father would be a hero, not a prisoner in Azkaban. His family would be honored, not disgraced. He, Draco, would be a prince, not a terrified, sobbing wreck in a derelict bathroom. All of his fear, all of his self-hatred, all of his despair coalesced into a single, burning point of hatred, directed at the boy standing before him. He lunged, casting a curse. Potter blocked it. The bathroom erupted into a chaos of shattered mirrors and exploding pipes. Water sprayed everywhere, flooding the floor. Spells, lethal and unforgiving, flew between them. This was not a schoolboy duel. This was a fight to the death. Draco cast the Cruciatus Curse, a spell he had only ever heard his Aunt Bellatrix use, a curse of pure, unadulterated pain. The word felt ugly and wrong in his mouth. Potter, his face grim, his glasses spattered with water, raised his own wand and shouted an incantation Draco had never heard before. Sectumsempra. A searing, unimaginable pain ripped through Draco's chest and face as if he had been slashed with an invisible sword. He staggered backwards, his hand flying to his chest, and came away wet and sticky with his own blood. He looked down and saw deep, bleeding gashes blooming across his white shirt, turning it a brilliant, shocking crimson. The shock was so profound he could not even scream. He collapsed onto the flooded floor, the cold water mingling with his warm blood. The world began to swim, the edges of his vision turning dark. He was dying. The thought was strangely calm, a quiet statement of fact. He was bleeding to death on the floor of a bathroom, killed by his oldest enemy. Through the haze of pain, he heard Myrtle screaming. He heard footsteps, a voice. Snape. He felt himself being lifted, felt the cool, precise touch of a wand on his wounds as Snape began to murmur, a counter-curse, a strange, song-like incantation. The bleeding slowed, the raw edges of the wounds knitting back together. The pain began to recede, replaced by a cold, heavy exhaustion. Snape saved his life. He half-carried him to the hospital wing, his grip firm, his face an unreadable mask of grim concentration. Draco was left in a bed, the white sheets a stark contrast to the memory of his own blood. As he drifted into a pained, exhausted sleep, he understood something with a chilling clarity. Harry Potter, the boy he hated more than anyone in the world, had nearly killed him, and Severus Snape, the man he had been ordered not to trust, had saved him. The world was no longer black and white. It was a terrifying, chaotic mess of gray, and he was drowning in it, the highest tower and the lowest courage. The night air was cold on the Astronomy Tower, a sharp contrast to the stifling fear that was choking Draco. He had done it. He had finally repaired the vanishing cabinet. The door was open. Downstairs, in the room of requirement, the Death Eaters were spilling into the castle, their sounds of battle and destruction already echoing up through the stone floors. He had succeeded. This should have been a moment of triumph, of vindication. Instead, it was the most terrifying moment of his life. He had cornered Dumbledore just as he had been ordered to do. The old man was weak, his wand hand blackened and cursed, his face etched with a weary resignation. He was unarmed, having just returned from a draining ordeal. It was the perfect opportunity. Dumbledore was his to kill, but he could not do it. His wand hand, the same one that now bore the dark mark, trembled uncontrollably. The killing curse, Avada Kedavra, was on the tip of his tongue. Two simple words that could end it all, that could save his family. But the words would not come. He looked at Dumbledore, at the calm, sad eyes behind the half-moon spectacles, and he saw not an enemy, but a man who was talking to him, his voice gentle, not with anger, but with a strange, unnerving pity. Dumbledore was offering him a way out. He was offering him protection for himself and his mother. He was talking about choices, about turning back from the path he was on. For a wild, desperate moment, Draco considered it. He could lower his wand. He could accept the offer. He could be free of the fear, of the crushing weight of his task. But then he heard the footsteps. The other Death Eaters were arriving on the tower, his monstrous aunt Bellatrix Lestrange among them, her face contorted with a manic glee. They saw him there, with Dumbledore cornered at his mercy, and they urged him on. "Do it, Draco! Do it!" Bellatrix shrieked, her voice a grating screech. He was trapped between two impossible choices. On one side, Dumbledore, offering a salvation he was not sure he deserved, a path that would require a courage he did not possess. On the other, his so-called allies, goading him towards an act of murder that would shatter his soul, but might, just might, keep his family alive. He was paralyzed, a puppet whose strings were being pulled in opposite directions. His arm ached with the effort of holding his wand aloft. He was just a boy, in over his head, standing on the highest tower of the castle, feeling the lowest he had ever felt in his life. And then Snape was there. He strode forward, his face a cold, unreadable mask. He looked at Draco, his black eyes lingering for a moment, and in that gaze, Draco saw a flicker of something. Was it contempt? Pity? An order? He did not know. He only knew that he had failed. He lowered his wand arm slightly, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of surrender. He could not do it. Snape stepped in front of him, raising his own wand. Dumbledore's eyes met Snape's, and there was a silent, profound understanding in that final look. Snape spoke the two words that Draco could not. Avada Kedavra. A jet of green light erupted from Snape's wand, hitting Dumbledore squarely in the chest. The old man was lifted from his feet, his body hanging in the air for a single, silent moment. And then he fell, a limp, broken shape, over the battlements and into the darkness below. The sound of Bellatrix's triumphant shriek was obscene. She fired the dark mark into the sky, the green skull and serpent illuminating the tower in a sickly, horrifying light. The Death Eaters were jubilant. They grabbed Draco, pushing him along with them as they began their escape from the castle. Draco moved, as if in a trance. The world had narrowed to a series of disjointed images and sounds. The burning smell of a cursed hut. The sight of Snape, his face like stone, deflecting curses from a pursuing, grief-stricken Harry Potter. The screams and shouts from the battle still raging below. He had not killed Dumbledore, but Dumbledore was dead because of him. He had opened the door. He had led the murderers into the castle. He had stood by and watched as the final, fatal curse was cast. He was not a killer, but he was a conspirator. His hands were not stained with blood, but his soul felt irrevocably tainted. He had wanted power. He had wanted to restore his family's honor. But standing on that tower, he had learned the true meaning of powerlessness. He had made a choice by not making one, and the consequences would follow him for the rest of his life. The house that echoes with footsteps. Malfoy Manor had once been a symbol of power and prestige. Now it was a prison. It was the headquarters of the Dark Lord, a place of constant fear and dread. The elegant drawing room, with its high ceilings and ancestral portraits, had been transformed into Voldemort's throne room. His giant snake, Nagini, slithered across the polished floors, its presence a constant, chilling reminder of its master's deadly whims. Draco lived in a state of suspended terror. He and his parents were prisoners in their own home. Their status had plummeted. They were no longer trusted advisors, but disgraced servants, their lives hanging by a thread. Lucius, recently released from Azkaban, was a broken man. The arrogant, powerful patriarch who had dominated Draco's childhood was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed ghost who flinched at every raised voice. Narcissa was a nervous wreck, her every waking moment dedicated to the impossible task of keeping her son alive. The manor was constantly filled with Death Eaters. They were a brutal, thuggish presence, treating the Malfoys with open contempt. They ate their food, drank their wine, and sullied the ancient halls with their dark magic and their casual cruelty. Draco would lock himself in his room for hours, trying to block out the sounds of their raucous laughter and the occasional chilling scream that echoed up from the dungeons. His aunt Bellatrix was a particularly terrifying presence. Her madness was a wild, unpredictable force. She saw Draco's failure on the Astronomy Tower, not as a moment of weakness, but as a near betrayal. Her eyes followed him with a burning, fanatical suspicion. She would taunt him, question his loyalty, her voice a high, childish sing-song that made his skin crawl. He lived in mortal fear of her. The most horrifying moments were when Voldemort would summon them to the drawing room. They would stand before him, trembling as he delivered his pronouncements, his red eyes scanning their faces for any sign of dissent. He seemed to take a particular sadistic pleasure in humiliating Lucius, mocking his failures and stripping him of his dignity piece by piece. Draco had to stand and watch, his face a carefully blank mask, while his father was systematically destroyed. The love and fear he had once felt for his father curdled into a bitter mix of pity and contempt. Then came the night the Snatchers brought prisoners to the manor. Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger. Their faces were distorted, Potter's swollen, and unrecognizable from a stinging jinx. But Draco knew. The moment he looked into those familiar green eyes, behind the puffy, disfigured flesh, he knew it was him. His aunt Bellatrix pushed him forward, demanding he identify them. "Is it him? Is it Harry Potter?" she shrieked, her breath hot on his face. This was his moment. He could end it all right there. One word from him, and Potter would be dead. He would be a hero to the Dark Lord. His family's honor would be restored. Everything he had been raised to believe in, everything his father had ever wanted for him, could be achieved with a single word. He hesitated. He looked at Potter, at Weasley, at Granger, all of them terrified, beaten, but still defiant. He thought of the bathroom, the flash of green light, the feeling of his own blood spilling onto the floor. He thought of Dumbledore falling from the tower. He saw the path that confirming Potter's identity would set him on, a path of no return. He mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I can't be sure." He looked away, unable to meet Potter's gaze. Unable to face the frantic hope in Hermione's eyes, he lied. It was not an act of courage. It was an act of pure, undiluted terror. He was not trying to save Potter. He was trying to save himself from the consequences of handing him over. He was a coward. He could not bring himself to be a killer, but he also could not bring himself to be a hero. He chose the gray space in between, the murky, soul-crushing territory of inaction. The events that followed were a chaotic, terrifying blur. The prisoners escaped, with the help of the house elf Dobby. Bellatrix, in a fit of rage, threw a silver knife. Voldemort, when he arrived, was incandescent with fury. The punishment he inflicted on the Malfoy family was terrible. But they were alive. They had survived, by the thinnest of margins. Draco retreated into himself, the echoes of the screams from the drawing room replaying in his mind. He had been given a choice, a chance to definitively pick a side, and he had chosen neither. He had chosen only to survive. A name you almost speak. The final battle for Hogwarts was not a battle Draco ever intended to fight. His only goal was to find a way to appease the Dark Lord, to somehow get back on the winning side, a side he was no longer sure even existed. Voldemort had hinted that if Draco could capture Harry Potter, all would be forgiven. It was a desperate, last-ditch plan, born of pure self-preservation. He, along with Crabbe and Goyle, slipped back into the castle during the chaos. Their mission was not to fight for the Dark Lord's cause, but to complete a private task that might save their own skins. They cornered Harry, Ron, and Hermione in the Room of Requirement, the same room that had been Draco's workshop of fear for an entire year. He stood there, his wand pointed at his old rival. The scene was a distorted echo of their countless confrontations in the school corridors, but the stakes were infinitely higher. The air crackled with tension. Draco demanded that Harry hand over his wand, his voice trying for its old arrogance but coming out thin and reedy. He looked different. The fear of the past 2 years had etched itself onto his face, leaving him looking older and more worn than a boy of 17 should. He was no longer the confident Prince of Slytherin. He was a cornered animal, acting on pure instinct. He was losing control of his own side. Crabbe, always more brutish than intelligent, was growing impatient. He refused to listen to Draco, his eyes alight with a stupid, malevolent glee. He wanted to kill them. He wanted to use the dark magic he had been taught to finally unleash his full power. Draco tried to reason with him, to remind him that the Dark Lord wanted Potter alive. But Crabbe was beyond reason. With a roar, he unleashed the Fiendfyre, a cursed fire of immense, uncontrollable power. Gigantic, monstrous shapes of flame erupted from his wand serpents, chimeras, and dragons, all roaring and consuming everything in their path. The fire had its own malevolent intelligence. It was not just burning, it was hunting them. Panic, absolute and overwhelming, seized Draco. This was a magic far beyond anything he had ever witnessed. It was pure destruction, a raging inferno that did not distinguish between friend and foe. The priceless magical artifacts, stored in the Room of Requirement, centuries of accumulated history, were turning to ash in seconds. Crabbe, the fool who had summoned the blaze, was consumed by his own spell, his screams cut short by the roaring flames. Draco and Goyle were trapped, scrambling up a teetering pile of junk, the fire licking at their heels. They were going to die. It was a stupid, pointless, terrifying end. And then, through the smoke and the roaring heat, he saw them, Harry Potter and Ron Weasley, flying on broomsticks. They circled back. They came back for them. Harry swooped down, his arm outstretched. Draco, without a second's hesitation, grabbed onto the back of the broom, his arms wrapped tightly around his enemy's waist. Ron managed to grab Goyle. As they flew towards the door, towards safety, Draco held on for dear life. He could feel the heat of the fire on his back, could hear the demonic roar of the flames below. He was pressed against the boy he had hated, tormented, and tried to capture for years, and that boy was saving his life. The world outside the room of requirement was a blur of smoke and green light. They landed heavily in a corridor, coughing, their faces black with soot. For a moment, the four of them just stood there, enemies united by a shared, terrifying experience. Draco could not find the words to say thank you. The concept was too alien, the situation too bizarre. He simply gave a jerky, terrified nod, and then he and Goyle scrambled away, disappearing into the chaos of the battle. He did not fight anymore after that. He had lost his wand in the fire, and with it, any remaining desire to be a part of the conflict. He was just trying to survive. He saw things that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He saw a Death Eater try to kill a student and cast a curse to protect her, a small, instinctive act of decency that surprised even himself. He saw Fred Weasley die, his face frozen in a final laugh, and the raw, animal grief of the Weasley family. He saw the bodies of people he had known, teachers and students, laid out in the Great Hall. The war was not a glorious crusade for pure blood supremacy. It was just this. It was blood and fire and the senseless, brutal death of children. He finally understood. The ideology his father had fed him was a lie. A pretty story told to justify an ugly, insatiable hunger for power. And he had almost been consumed by it. Fire that does not care who you are. In the brief, eerie lull in the fighting, when Voldemort called a temporary truce and demanded Harry Potter's surrender, Draco was reunited with his parents. They found him in the chaos of the entrance hall, two pale, frantic figures cutting through the crowd of warriors and wounded. Narcissa's hands fluttered over him, checking for injuries, her face a mask of desperate relief. Lucius looked at him, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of fear and a desperate, clinging pride. They did not belong there. The Malfoys, in their expensive tailored robes, now smudged with soot and dust, were an anomaly in the midst of the raw courage and grief that filled the castle. They were not fighters. They were survivors, political animals whose skills were useless in a war of raw magical power and ideological conviction. Lucius tried to pull Draco away, to get him to join the victorious side that was massing in the Forbidden Forest. "Come, son," he urged, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We must go to the Dark Lord." But Draco resisted. He did not want to go. He did not want to face the snake-like monster he had served out of fear. He did not want to be on that side anymore. He was not brave enough to join the other side, the side of the people who were dying to defend the castle. But he could not bring himself to walk back into the darkness. He was pulled along anyway, a listless, unwilling participant in his family's desperate attempt to secure their place with the victor. They stood at the edge of the crowd of Death Eaters as Voldemort displayed what he claimed was the body of Harry Potter, carried by a grief-stricken Hagrid. A great, collective cry of despair rose from the castle's defenders. Draco felt a cold numbness spread through him. Potter was dead. It was over. The Dark Lord had won. A part of him, the part that had been conditioned since birth, felt a flicker of relief. They had survived. They had chosen the winning side. But it felt like ash in his mouth. He watched as Neville Longbottom stood up, defiant and brave, a true Gryffindor to the last. He watched as Voldemort tortured him. And then he watched, in stunned disbelief, as Harry Potter fell from Hagrid's arms, alive and ready to fight. Chaos erupted. The battle reignited with a renewed ferocity. In the confusion, Narcissa grabbed Draco's hand, her grip like steel. Lucius, his face a mask of bewildered terror, followed them. They were not running to fight. They were just running, away from Voldemort, away from the battle, away from the choices they had made. They ran through the Great Hall, dodging curses from both sides, a family of three, united only by their shared, desperate desire to escape the consequences of their own ambition. They were irrelevant. In the final decisive duel between Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort, The Malfoys were not even a footnote. They were cowering in a corner, their power, their wealth, their name, all meaningless in the face of true courage and true evil. Draco watched as Voldemort's own killing curse rebounded, and the Dark Lord fell to the floor, dead. The Great Hall erupted in a deafening roar of triumph and relief. The sun was rising, its golden light streaming through the shattered windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The war was over. Draco stood with his parents, huddled together, a small, isolated island in a sea of celebration. No one approached them. They were pariahs, ghosts at the victory feast. They had survived, but they were utterly, completely alone. He looked across the hall, at the Weasleys, mourning their dead but surrounded by love and comradeship. He looked at Harry Potter, exhausted and battered, but surrounded by people who would die for him. Draco Malfoy had everything a boy could want: wealth, a famous name, a life of privilege. But in that moment, in the great echoing hall filled with the survivors of a terrible war, he had never felt so poor. He had survived the Fiendfyre, a magical, all-consuming blaze. But he now faced a different kind of fire: the long, slow burn of shame, and the difficult, uncertain task of figuring out who he was, now that the grand, terrible story he had been born into had finally come to an end. The morning after a ruined era, the days and weeks following the Battle of Hogwarts were a strange, disorienting blur. The wizarding world was rebuilding itself, brick by brick, law by law. There were funerals to attend, heroes to celebrate, and villains to prosecute. The Malfoys found themselves in a precarious, uncertain position, adrift in the new, unfamiliar landscape of a world without Voldemort. They avoided Azkaban. It was a close-run thing, a fate they escaped not through influence or wealth, but through two small, pivotal acts of self-preservation that were reinterpreted by the victors as acts of reluctant conscience. Narcissa's lie to Voldemort in the Forbidden Forest, her declaration that Harry Potter was dead when she knew he was alive, was the deciding factor. She had done it to save her son, to get back to the castle and find him. But in doing so, she had given Harry the crucial advantage he needed to win the war. It was an act of maternal love that had accidentally saved the world. Draco's own hesitation in Malfoy Manor, his refusal to definitively identify Harry, was also brought to light. Harry himself spoke in their defense, a gesture of magnanimity that Draco found both humbling and deeply uncomfortable. He had been saved by the two people he had wronged the most: his mother, whose love he had taken for granted, and his enemy, whose life he had made a misery. They were placed under a form of house arrest at the manor, their wands confiscated, their movements monitored by the ministry. Aurors would come and go, searching the house for any remaining dark artifacts, their presence a constant, humiliating reminder of the family's fall from grace. The manor itself felt tainted, haunted by the memory of the horrors that had taken place within its walls. The drawing room was scrubbed clean, but Draco could still feel the cold presence of Voldemort, could still hear the echoes of screams. Lucius Malfoy was a shadow of his former self. His power, his influence, his connections, all had evaporated overnight. He wandered the halls of his home like a ghost, his snake-headed cane gone, his posture stooped. He had played the game of power and lost spectacularly. He had no answers, no grand strategy to restore their fortunes. He was simply a defeated man. Draco looked at his father and for the first time felt not fear or awe, but a profound, aching pity. The man he had spent his entire life trying to impress was gone, leaving only this empty shell. The relationship between them, once defined by a rigid hierarchy of expectation and approval, became strained and awkward. They had nothing to say to each other. Draco's entire worldview, the one Lucius had so carefully constructed for him, had been shattered. The pureblood ideology, the belief in their inherent superiority, the disdain for Muggles and Muggleborns, it all seemed like a hollow, foolish lie in the cold light of day. He had seen the reality of that ideology in the Fiendfyre, in the dead bodies in the Great Hall, in the mad gleam in his Aunt Bellatrix's eyes. He spent most of his time alone, walking the grounds of the estate. The peacocks, with their arrogant beauty, now seemed ridiculous to him. He found no comfort in the trappings of his wealth. It was all just stuff, meaningless objects in a house full of ghosts. He was forced to confront the boy he had been, the bully, the bigot, the coward. The shame was a physical weight, a constant, heavy presence in his chest. He had to return to Hogwarts to complete his 7th year, an edict from the new Minister for Magic, Kingsley Shacklebolt. It was meant to be a gesture of reconciliation, a chance for the students whose education had been disrupted by the war to find some sense of normalcy. For Draco, it was a sentence. He walked the familiar corridors of the castle not as a prince, but as a pariah. He was ostracized by most of the students. The Gryffindors, Hufflepuffs, and Ravenclaws looked at him with a mixture of contempt and pity. Even the Slytherins, his own house, kept their distance. He was a symbol of the losing side, a reminder of a dark chapter they were all trying to forget. He sat alone in the Great Hall, ate alone, and studied alone. He kept his head down, avoided eye contact, and spoke only when spoken to. The arrogance and the sneer were gone, stripped away by fear and shame. He was quiet, subdued, a ghost haunting the scenes of his former life. It was a long, lonely, and humbling year. It was the first year of the rest of his life, the morning after a ruined era, and he had no idea what to do with it. Letters that are hard to write. After his lonely final year at Hogwarts, Draco retreated to the seclusion of Malfoy Manor. The world outside was moving on, celebrating its victory and rebuilding its institutions. But for Draco, the war was not over. It continued to rage inside him, a silent, internal battle against the ghosts of his past. He felt an overwhelming need to apologize, to somehow acknowledge the harm he had caused. But the words felt clumsy and inadequate. How do you apologize for years of cruelty, for a worldview that had contributed to so much pain and death? The shame was a gag, silencing him. He started with his mother. He found Narcissa in the conservatory, tending to her lilies. He sat with her for a long time, in a silence that was thick with unspoken words. Finally, he thanked her. He thanked her for lying in the forest, for saving him. He told her he was sorry for the fear he had put her through, for being the son who had brought so much darkness to their door. She did not say much, but she took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt a flicker of uncomplicated love, a connection that went deeper than pride or status. His father was a more difficult proposition. Lucius was locked in his own world of bitterness and regret. Any attempt by Draco to discuss what had happened was met with a wall of defensive denial. In his father's eyes, their only crime had been to back the losing side. There was no moral reckoning, no acknowledgement of the evil they had served. Draco realized with a sinking heart that his father would never change. The chasm between them was too wide to bridge. He began to slowly, painfully, emotionally divest himself from the man whose approval he had once craved above all else. The hardest letters were the ones he knew he had to write, to the people he had wronged the most. He spent weeks drafting and redrafting a letter to Hermione Granger. He filled pages with florid, self-pitying apologies, then tore them up in disgust. Finally, he wrote a few simple, unadorned sentences. He apologized for the word he had used against her, the word he could now barely bring himself to think. He acknowledged that his prejudice had been born of ignorance and arrogance, and that he was deeply ashamed of the pain he had caused. He did not ask for forgiveness. He knew he had not earned it. He sent the letter by owl, with no expectation of a reply. He did not receive one. But months later, he read in the Daily Prophet that Hermione Granger, now a rising star in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, had successfully passed a new law improving the rights and welfare of house elves. He thought of Dobby, the brave little elf who had died saving them, and he felt a strange, quiet sense of rightness in the world. He also wrote to the Weasleys, a letter addressed to the whole family. It was the most difficult letter of all. He tried to express his sorrow for their loss, for the death of Fred. He knew his words were hollow, that they could do nothing to ease their grief. He spoke of his regret for his years of mockery, for his disdain for their family, a family that had shown more courage and love than his own ever had. He sent the letter, his hands trembling. The reply, when it came, was not from Arthur or Molly, or even from Ron. It was a short, terse note from George Weasley. It said only, "I'm glad my brother died laughing. It's more than your lot deserved." The words were like a slap, but Draco knew he deserved them. The anger in the note was clean, honest. He folded the piece of parchment and kept it. It was a reminder. He never wrote to Harry Potter. The debt he owed him was too great, the history between them too complex. An apology felt like an insult. What he could offer instead was a quiet, consistent effort to be a better man. He would live his life in a way that honored the second chance Potter had given him. That would have to be enough. These acts of contrition were not a magic cure. They did not erase the past or absolve him of his guilt, but they were a start. They were the first, faltering steps on a long, difficult road. Each letter written, each difficult truth acknowledged, was a small stone being laid in the foundation of a new life, a life that was his own, not one that had been inherited. A softer rebellion, named Astoria. In the years after the war, the Malfoy name was poison in pure-blood society. The families who had once courted Lucius's favor now shunned them. They were seen as failures, a disgrace. Draco, accompanying his parents to the few social events they were still invited to, felt the cold stares, heard the whispered insults. The world he had been raised to rule had turned its back on him. It was at one of these stilted, uncomfortable gatherings that he reconnected with Astoria Greengrass. She was the younger sister of his old Slytherin classmate, Daphne Greengrass. He remembered her as a quiet, younger girl from school. Now, she was a young woman with a calm, intelligent gaze and a gentle smile that seemed entirely out of place in the viper's nest of post-war, pure-blood politics. Astoria was different. Her family, the Greengrasses, had been part of the so-called Sacred 28, the list of truly pure-blood families. They had maintained a careful neutrality during the war, a feat of political dexterity that left them with their reputation intact, but with few true allies. Astoria, however, had quietly shed the prejudices of her upbringing. The war had horrified her, and she had come to believe that the old ideas of blood purity were a destructive poison. She spoke to Draco without judgment. She did not see him as a disgraced Death Eater or a failed villain. She saw a young man who was lost, grappling with a terrible inheritance. She listened. She asked him questions about himself, about what he thought, what he felt, not about what his father had done or what the Dark Lord had commanded. It was a revolutionary experience for Draco. He was used to being seen as a symbol, a name, a role. Astoria saw him as a person. Their courtship was a quiet, gentle affair. They would walk for hours in the gardens of her family's estate, talking. With her, he found he could be honest about his fears, his shame, his confusion. He told her about the Astronomy Tower, about the Room of Requirement, about the suffocating fear that had governed his life. He did not make excuses for himself, but he allowed her to see the terrified boy behind the bully's mask. Astoria's presence was a balm to his wounded soul. She was not impressed by his wealth or his name. In fact, she challenged him. She argued against the pure-blood dogma he still sometimes parroted out of habit. She did it not with anger or accusation, but with a calm, unshakable reason. She was a softer, gentler kind of rebel than the Gryffindors he had known. But she was a rebel nonetheless. She was quietly and firmly dismantling the world he had been raised in, and she was inviting him to help her. Lucius and Narcissa were appalled by the match. Astoria was a pure blood, yes, but she was a blood traitor in her views. She did not believe in raising her children to think that Muggles were scum. She represented a dilution of the Malfoy ideology, a surrender to the New World Order. They saw her as a corrupting influence, a threat to the family's legacy. For the first time in his life, Draco defied his parents. He chose Astoria. It was the bravest, most definitive choice he had ever made. He realized that he did not want the legacy his parents were so desperate to preserve. He did not want to pass on the poison of prejudice to his own children. He wanted to build something new, something better. He wanted the quiet, gentle strength that he saw in Astoria. They were married in a small, private ceremony, with only a few friends and family present. It was not the grand society wedding his parents had always envisioned for him. It was something far more precious. It was a choice. It was a beginning. Marrying Astoria Greengrass was not just an act of love, it was an act of rebellion. It was the moment Draco Malfoy truly began to unlearn the lessons of his father and to build a house of his own, founded not on pride and power, but on the radical, quiet principles of kindness and change. The long apprenticeship to gentleness. Life with Astoria was a quiet revelation. The rhythms of their days at Malfoy Manor were unlike anything Draco had ever known. The grand, cold rooms began to feel less like a museum and more like a home. Astoria filled them with light and warmth, not just by redecorating in softer colors and fabrics, but with her very presence. She had a calm, steadying influence that soothed the restless, anxious parts of Draco's soul. It was a long and often difficult apprenticeship. The habits of a lifetime are not easily unlearned. The sneer, the sarcastic retort, the casual cruelty, these were reflexes, defense mechanisms he had honed over years. There were times he would say something sharp, something dismissive, and he would see a flicker of hurt in Astoria's eyes. The sight of it was like a physical blow. He hated the parts of himself that could cause her pain. She never scolded him. Instead, she would simply look at him with her clear, honest gaze and ask him why he had said it. The question would force him to look inward, to dissect the ugly, insecure impulse behind the words. It was a painstaking process of self-examination. He began to understand that his arrogance had always been a mask for his fear, his cruelty a shield for his vulnerability. Astoria taught him about the world beyond the narrow confines of pure blood society. She read Muggle books, listened to Muggle music, and spoke of the non-magical world with a genuine curiosity that Draco found both baffling and intriguing. She gently challenged the caricature of Muggles he had been fed his entire life, replacing it with a more complex and human picture. He began to see that the world was not a simple hierarchy with purebloods at the top, but a rich, messy, and fascinating tapestry of different kinds of people with different kinds of strengths. They traveled not to the grand wizarding capitals of Europe, but to quiet, out-of-the-way places. They visited Muggle art galleries, walked through bustling city streets, and ate in small, non-magical restaurants. For Draco, it was like learning a new language. He was often awkward and out of place, but Astoria's quiet confidence guided him. He learned to observe, to listen, to appreciate a world that was not defined by magic or blood status. His relationship with his parents remained strained. Lucius and Narcissa lived in a separate wing of the manor, their lives a quiet echo of a bygone era. They treated Astoria with a cool, formal politeness that barely concealed their disapproval. Draco found himself acting as a reluctant bridge between two worlds, the old world of his parents' rigid ideology and the new world he was trying to build with his wife. The greatest lesson Astoria taught him was about strength. He had always associated strength with power, with dominance, with the ability to command fear and respect. Astoria's strength was of a different kind. It was a quiet, resilient strength, rooted in her convictions and her compassion. She had the courage to be kind in a world that was often cruel. She had the strength to choose love over hate, understanding over prejudice. Draco began to see that true strength was not in the ability to inflict pain, but in the ability to heal. It was in the patience to listen, the courage to apologize, the grace to forgive. He was a clumsy, slow student in this new school of gentleness. He made mistakes, he stumbled, but for the first time in his life, he had a teacher he trusted and a reason to learn. He was slowly, painstakingly, being remade by love, fatherhood, and the untangling of a snare. The birth of their son, Scorpius, changed everything. Draco had never thought of himself as a father. The model he had for the role was his own father, Lucius, a man who had treated him less like a son and more like an heir, a vessel for the family's ambition. Draco knew, with an unshakable certainty, that he had to be different. Holding his son for the first time was a terrifying, humbling experience. Scorpius was so small, so perfect, so utterly dependent on him. In that moment, looking down at the tuft of pale blonde hair so like his own, Draco felt the last, rusted chains of his father's influence break and fall away. His life was no longer about redeeming the Malfoy name. It was about ensuring that this small, innocent boy would never have to carry the burdens that he had carried. He and Astoria made a vow. They would not raise their son in the shadow of the past. They would not teach him the poison of blood purity. They would raise him to be a good man, a kind man, a man who judged others by the content of their character, not the purity of their blood. It was a direct, explicit rejection of everything Lucius Malfoy stood for. This decision created the final, irreparable rift with his parents. Lucius and Narcissa were horrified. To them, raising a Malfoy without the core beliefs of their heritage was a betrayal of everything their family had ever been. The family gatherings became tense, unbearable affairs, with Lucius making pointed, bitter remarks about the way they were raising their son. The arguments were quiet, but vicious. Finally, for the sake of their own peace and Scorpius's future, Draco and Astoria made the difficult decision to largely cut off contact. The great, cold manor now held two separate, silent households. Draco threw himself into fatherhood with a quiet, desperate intensity. He was a hands-on father, changing nappies, feeding, and walking the floors at night with a crying baby. These simple domestic acts were a form of therapy, a way of grounding himself in a reality that was pure and good. He wanted to give Scorpius the childhood he never had, one filled with warmth, affection, and the freedom to be himself. Astoria's health, however, was a constant, low-level source of anxiety. She had been born with a blood curse, an ancient affliction on her family line that left her frail and vulnerable. They had known that childbirth would be a risk, but it was a risk she had been determined to take. She loved Scorpius with a fierce, protective energy, but Draco could see the toll it took on her. This knowledge lent a precious, poignant quality to their family life. Every moment was a gift. Draco found himself collecting memories, not trophies. He would watch Astoria reading to Scorpius by the fire, her voice soft and gentle, and he would feel a surge of love so intense it was painful. He was learning to live in the present, to savor the small, perfect moments of a quiet life. As Scorpius grew, Draco saw a kind, curious, and slightly geeky boy emerging. A boy who loved books and sweets, and who had his mother's gentle heart. He was nothing like the arrogant, swaggering child Draco had been. This was Draco's greatest triumph. He had successfully broken the cycle. He had untangled the snare of his own upbringing, so that his son could run free. The fear for Astoria was always there, a shadow at the edge of their happiness. But he did not let it consume him. Instead, he let it teach him. It taught him to be grateful, to be present, to love without reservation. He had spent the first half of his life trapped in a prison of pride and prejudice. Fatherhood and his love for Astoria had finally set him free. The Quiet Handshake. The wizarding world has a long memory. Even years after the war, Draco Malfoy was still a name that drew stares in Diagon Alley, a name that made people whisper behind their hands. He learned to live with it, to wear a cloak of quiet dignity, to ignore the ghosts of his past that still lingered in the public imagination. He had his family, his quiet life. That was all that mattered. The inevitable, awkward encounters with his old classmates became a part of this new reality. He would see them from a distance. Neville Longbottom, now the popular herbology professor at Hogwarts, Luna Lovegood, a famous magizoologist. They would sometimes exchange a stiff, hesitant nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared, traumatic history. There was no warmth, but there was a lack of overt hostility, a kind of weary truce. The most difficult encounters were, inevitably, with the trio who had been at the center of his school day world. He once found himself standing behind Hermione Granger, in the queue at Flourish and Blots. She was now a high-ranking official in the Ministry of Magic, a woman of immense intellect and influence. She turned, saw him, and for a moment the old tension was there, a ghost in the space between them. He simply nodded, his expression carefully neutral. She nodded back, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, before turning away. It was not forgiveness, but it was a kind of peace. He saw Ron Weasley at the Quidditch World Cup. Weasley was there with his family, loud and happy, a gaggle of red-headed children running around his feet. Their eyes met across the crowded top box. Weasley's expression hardened for a moment, the memory of 1,000 insults and a dead brother flashing between them. Then his wife Hermione touched his arm, and the moment passed. They ignored each other for the rest of the match. The most significant encounters were with Harry Potter. They would see each other every year on September 1st, on platform 9 3/4, as they brought their own sons to the Hogwarts Express. It was a strange, surreal ritual. Two middle-aged men, their once deadly rivalry, now reduced to the shared mundane anxiety of parenthood. Harry Potter, the head of the Auror Department, the savior of the wizarding world, was now just a father, trying to reassure his nervous son, Albus. Draco Malfoy, the disgraced scion of a dark family, was just a father, fussing over Scorpius's luggage. Their sons, Albus Potter and Scorpius Malfoy, had, against all odds, become best friends. It was an irony so profound that it was almost comical. They would stand on the platform, a few feet apart, watching the train pull away. The first few years, they exchanged only a brief, tense nod. But as the years went on, as they saw their son's friendship blossom, a slow, imperceptible thaw began. One year, after waving their boys off, they found themselves walking towards the exit at the same time. The silence was awkward. It was Harry who broke it. He made a quiet comment about Scorpius, about how he seemed like a good kid. Draco, surprised, found himself replying, saying that Albus was a fine boy too. They spoke for a few minutes, their conversation stilted and cautious. They did not talk about the war. They did not talk about the past. They talked about their children. They talked about how difficult it was to be a father, how much you worried. They found, to their mutual astonishment, that they had something in common. As they parted ways, Harry turned and extended his hand. Draco looked at it for a long moment. He thought of the first time he had offered his hand to Harry on the Hogwarts Express all those years ago. A gesture of arrogant self-interest, an offer of the wrong kind of friendship. He had been so sure of himself then, so sure of the way the world worked. He had been wrong about everything. He reached out and took Harry's hand. The handshake was firm, brief. It was not a gesture of friendship. Not really. It was something quieter, something more complex. It was an acknowledgement. It was an acceptance. It was a quiet, unspoken treaty, a final, definitive end to a war that had begun between two 11-year-old boys in a train compartment, a lifetime ago. A house rebuilt without trophies, Astoria's death was not a sudden, violent event like the deaths Draco had witnessed in the war. It was a slow, quiet fading. The blood curse that had shadowed her life finally claimed her. Draco and a 14-year-old Scorpius were with her at the end. Her last moments were peaceful, filled with love, but the grief that followed was a vast, silent ocean that threatened to drown them both. Draco, who had spent his adult life learning to dismantle the cold, emotionless facade his father had taught him, now had to grapple with a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical part of him had been carved away. But he could not afford to collapse. He had to be strong for his son. Scorpius was devastated, lost in the bewildered grief of a teenager who has lost his mother, his anchor, his kindest friend. Father and son clung to each other, two survivors on a small raft in a sea of sorrow. The great, echoing manor, which Astoria had filled with so much warmth, now felt cold and empty again. Her absence was a physical presence in every room. In the months that followed, Draco realized that his long apprenticeship to Gentleness had been a preparation for this. He had to become both father and mother to Scorpius. He had to learn to navigate the complex emotional landscape of a grieving teenager. He listened. He sat with Scorpius in his silence. He learned to make tea just the way Astoria used to. He was clumsy at it, but he kept trying. He made the conscious decision to fill the house not with distractions, but with memories of her. They kept her favorite books on the tables, her paintings on the walls. They spoke of her often, sharing stories, keeping her spirit alive. Grief, Draco learned, was not something to be conquered or overcome. It was something to be lived with, to be carried. It was the price of love. He focused his energy on his work, managing the Malfoy fortune, but he did it with a new perspective. He was no longer interested in acquiring power or influence. He used the family's wealth to support causes Astoria had believed in: magical creature welfare, historical preservation, educational charities. It was a quiet, anonymous form of penance, a way of using the resources of his dark past to build a better future. The manor was no longer a monument to pure blood pride. The dark artifacts in the cellar had long been confiscated or destroyed. The drawing room was now a comfortable library, filled with books from both the magical and muggle worlds. The portraits of his grim-faced ancestors were still there, but their judgmental stares had lost their power over him. He was no longer trying to live up to their expectations. His home was a house rebuilt. The old foundations of arrogance and prejudice had been torn out, replaced by something quieter and more resilient. It was a house built on love, loss, and the slow, painstaking work of becoming a better man. There were no trophies on the walls, no symbols of power or victory. The only treasures were the memories of a quiet life, of a gentle rebellion, of a love that had redeemed him. He was a man who had lost a great deal: his status, his certainty, the love of his life. But he had gained something far more valuable in return. He had gained himself. Epilogue. A man who unlearned his inheritance. The man who stands on platform 9 3/4 in his late 30s is a stranger to the boy who once swaggered onto the Hogwarts Express. The sneer has been replaced by a quiet watchfulness. The arrogance has been weathered away by grief and time, leaving behind a reserved, almost gentle demeanor. His hair is still pale, but there are lines of experience and sorrow around his gray eyes. He is Draco Malfoy, but he is not the Draco Malfoy the world remembers. He watches his son Scorpius board the train, laughing with his best friend Albus Potter. There is an ease and a genuine affection between the two boys that still, after all these years, causes a strange pang in Draco's chest. It is a mixture of pride and a faint, ghostly echo of an old regret for a friendship he himself might have had if he had been a different boy. He gives Harry Potter a nod. It is the familiar, quiet greeting of two men bound by a complex history and the simple, universal experience of fatherhood. There are no grand speeches, no dramatic reconciliations. There is just this, a quiet, unassuming peace. They are not friends, but they are no longer enemies. They are simply two survivors, living their lives as best they can. Draco has learned that redemption is not a single heroic act. It is not a dramatic, public apology that washes the slate clean. It is a quiet, daily practice. It is the conscious choice to be kind, when it would be easier to be cruel. It is the patience to listen, the humility to learn, and the courage to admit when you are wrong. It is the slow, painstaking work of unlearning a lifetime of prejudice, of untangling the knots of a toxic inheritance. His life is not a grand heroic tale. It is a quiet story. It is the story of a man who was raised to be a prince and learned to be a father. A man who was taught to value power and came to cherish love. A man who was born into a house of darkness and chose to build a life of quiet light. As the train pulls away from the station, carrying his son towards a future he hopes will be brighter than his own past, Draco Malfoy feels a sense of peace. He is no longer defined by the weight of his name or the ghosts of his youth. He is defined by the choices he has made, by the love he has given and received, by the quiet, difficult work of becoming a good man. The reflection in the mirror is finally his own.